When Tucker Carlson was the most popular host in cable news during his 6-year stint at Fox News, very few Republicans or conservatives were willing to criticize him, certainly not by name. When Tucker was fired from Fox for reasons that still are not quite clear, although in my view they obviously have something to do with his opposition to the kind of Republican ideological orthodoxy that the Murdoch family has long supported, including his opposition to the war in Ukraine and all sorts of other criticisms of the Republican Party and Republican leadership. There were several Republican congressmen who were delighted, gleeful over the fact that he had been fired, and they wanted to say so, but they were afraid to do so under their own name because of Tucker's popularity among the Republican base. He is probably more popular than any single politician outside of Donald Trump. Here from Axios, May 4th, 2023, which is the week that Tucker was fired, you see the headline, quote, "Good riddance. Republican lawmakers' private glee at Tucker Carlson's firing." Quote, "A sizable number of Republican lawmakers are quietly cheering Fox News' decision to remove Tucker Carlson from its airways as making it easier to provide aid to Ukraine," Axios has learned. What they're saying, multiple House Republicans speaking on the condition of anonymity slammed the former Fox News host with rhetoric on Vladimir Putin and Russian aggression, and said his inflammatory remarks on an array of issues often put them in a tough spot. Quote, "Tucker being gone makes my life easier with many things, including Ukraine," one Republican lawmaker said. Quote, "Though I think that somebody will own that space in a couple of weeks anyway." Another, quote, "Well, no one is more unhappy about Tucker's departure than the Russians," added another House Republican. Imagine the cowardice to be a member of Congress and to insinuate that Tucker Carlson is a Russian agent and to celebrate his firing only by hiding behind anonymity because you're so afraid, even though you're a member of Congress, to criticize this cable host. Quote, "A third lawmaker argued that Carlson, quote, thrived on destroying Republicans. I say good riddance." Such profiles encourage these people are, but it is illustrative of the point I'm making, which is that Tucker's popularity among conservatives meant that it was very rare ever to see him criticized. All of that changed when Tucker left Fox and began a new media company where he is completely independent. His new podcast that's barely beginning already skyrocketed to the top of every podcasting chart, ahead of the New York Times, Daily Show, ahead of NPR, ahead of every other show. And so now it is open season among many conservatives and Republicans on Tucker Carlson, where, as I said, they're not just disagreeing with his views, but obviously trying to destroy his reputation, to cancel him, if you will. And the question is why? Why was he so untouchable and popular when he was at Fox News? And yet now many conservatives feel so comfortable just maligning him in every conceivable way. Members of Congress now do that under their own Twitter account. Conservative journals do it all the time. If you look at Tucker Carlson's range of views that he expressed at Fox and compare it to the range of views that he expresses now, the only real difference you will find is that when he was at Fox, he basically avoided the issue of Israel entirely. He just never spoke about it. He didn't praise Israel. He didn't advocate for U.S. support for Israel. But he also never critiqued it or questioned it or criticized it. It was just an issue he largely avoided. And yet, since becoming independent, and obviously a big part of it is that a major war broke out between Israel and its Palestinian neighbors that the United States is heavily involved in, that we're funding and financing and arming and using our soft power to protect Israel, it's almost impossible not to talk about it. Whereas when he was at Fox, it was pretty much on the back burner. But in any event, he has become a leading critic of the U.S. support for Israel. He had me on his show very early on, after October 7th, to talk about the way in which conservatives, who were branding themselves free speech champions for years, suddenly decided to turn around and support censorship of Israel critics and pro-Palestinian activists, both on campus and beyond. But then it turned into a more holistic critique of the U.S. relationship to Israel. And most recently, he interviewed a pastor, a Christian pastor in the West Bank, who was highly critical of Israel. And that was basically the straw that broke the camel's back. where he's now not just questioning U.S. support for Israel, but actually dared to criticize this foreign country, something that has long been the surest way to destroy your career and reputation within Republican and conservative circles. And now you're seeing, especially among the United States' most fanatical supporters of Israel, an all-out effort to destroy Tucker's character. Here today, in the outlet called the Free Press, which was founded by Bari Weiss, who has branded herself a free speech champion, and yet at the same time has very little to say about the 6 or 7 months of censorship of Israel critics and pro-Palestinian activists on American campus, justified on the rationale that the left uses for its censorship, namely that views that veer into racism can't be tolerated because they make students unsafe. That is now the right-wing narrative about Israel critics on campus and therefore need to be censored. Bari Weiss's Free Press, and Barry's promoted this article today, written by Eli Lake, who is also a pure neocon, somebody fanatically supportive of Israel, has this as its headline, quote, Tucker Carlson's turn. Why is the pundit persuading the American right to abandon its rightful contempt for foreign tyrants, terrorists, and cranks? And this is what the article says, quote, when I turned in last June to watch Tucker's new show on X, it became apparent that Fox had kept him tethered to reality. Without a strong editor or producer at the wheel, his skepticism is curdled into sophistry. Now let me just say, I can't tell you how many times I heard that about myself after I left The Intercept. Even though people had no idea what they were talking about. I didn't have editorial supervision at The Intercept. I actually did have editorial supervision once I left The Intercept because I hired editors to work with me on my journalism. And Tucker's not out there alone working on his media company. He's surrounded by the same team he had at Fox News, but they just make things up. That, oh, he used to have editorial limitations and now he doesn't. This goes on, quote, he is now platforming conspiracy theorists, allowing them to spout falsehoods while never challenging the veracity of their claims. What was most appalling was Tucker's descent into moral relativism, his muddying of the line between good and evil. For Tucker, America is not exceptional. It is no better than its enemies. And this is particularly corrosive because he is persuading a large segment of the American right to abandon its rightful contempt for foreign tyrants, terrorists, and cranks. Now, just a reminder, Donald Trump in 2016 ran on a platform and then won the Republican nomination and ultimately the election of advocating against endless war, against Republican orthodoxy and foreign policy. It wasn't Tucker who was the first to do it, but Donald Trump, who said we fight far too many wars, we're involved in far too many countries' internal affairs. The war in Iraq was misguided and dumb. The war to change the governments of Libya and Syria were things we had no right to do, were things we shouldn't have been involved with. And it was under Donald Trump that the United States, for the first time in decades, did not start a new war. He inherited wars and escalated a couple of them, including the one against ISIS, but he did not start any new wars. And the Republican Party became far more skeptical of neocon foreign policy because of Donald Trump, which is why most leading neocons became the never Trump advocates and even joined the Democratic Party because they thought Hillary Clinton and then Joe Biden was a far more reliable vehicle for traditional antagonistic and warmongering foreign policy than Donald Trump would be. Here is Eli Lake's next paragraph. Quote, first came Moscow. He told us he was dazzled by the city's gleaming subways and orderly fast food restaurants. Then he interviewed Russian despot and world champion liar Vladimir Putin, allowing him to deliver a slanted history of his country's dominion over Western Ukraine. Never once did Tucker ask him about Alexei Navalny, the opposition leader who died 10 days after the interview in one of Putin's Arctic dungeons. The skepticism that served him well in the Trump years when much of the Fourth Estate behaved like an oppositional political party has led him all the way around the horseshoe. His opposition to the people he hates, liberals and neocons, has turned him into Noam Chomsky in a bow tie. Now, between the foreign policy of neocons and establishment liberals, the people who brought us into Iraq, into Vietnam, into Afghanistan, into Libya, into Syria, now into Ukraine, now into Israel, now into the Middle East. Between those people, neocons and establishment liberals on the one hand, and Noam Chomsky on the other, it's not difficult to determine whose foreign policy views have been more vindicated over the last several decades. Calling Tucker Noam Chomsky might be an insult in neocon circles, but to anyone who has become skeptical of the endless war posture of the United States, it ought to be considered high praise. He goes on, quote, Tucker has even adopted some of the same progressive talking points he once used to ridicule. For example, in February, Tucker said he despises former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley because of her hawkish foreign policy against Iran, claiming that her real agenda was to resurrect the military draft. Quote, I've got 4 draft-age children, he told comedian Russell Brand, so if you're playing recklessly, fast, and loose with their lives, then I have a right to despise you. So a big part of Tucker's transgression was that he despises Nikki Haley, who has advocated one war after the next while she's then sat on the board of Boeing and got very rich giving speeches to pro-Israel and pro-war think tanks. And that's Tucker's crime, that he says he despises Nikki Haley because of her history of sending other families into wars that have nothing to do with the United States, while never herself fighting or sending her own family to fight. He goes on, quote, but even after that, and now we get to the real reason Tucker needs to be smeared in a character-destructive way. But, quote, even after that, it's Tucker's interview last week with Munzer Isaac, a self-described evangelical Christian pastor who lives in Bethlehem, that most alarmed me. Exactly, it's criticism of Israel that is the obvious motive for destroying Tucker. Quote, unmentioned is the fact that Munzer is an extremist who praised the, quote, strength of those who invaded Israel on October 7th. The other curious omission is that Bethlehem is no longer governed by Israel. That is such a lie. Bethlehem is in the West Bank. It's in the part of Jerusalem that the IDF occupies and completely controls. And he goes on, quote, yet Isaac claimed that one of the biggest problems for Christians in Bethlehem is the Israeli occupation. Quote, people keep leaving because of the political reality. Life under a very harsh Israeli military occupation is difficult to bear. Tucker has also kept silent about Iran's strike on Saturday against Israel, our country's only democratic ally in the Middle East. He has said nothing about the lunatic fringe rising up in the United States, which is cheering on Iran. So I'm glad we took this big detour, but finally got to the real reason. Eli Lake and Barry Weiss and so many other devotees of standard American warmongering that has been so destructive to our country, to the people in our country, to our financial condition, to the standing in the world. They want that foreign policy to go on forever, especially to the extent that it involves support for Israel. And anybody who is in any influential position, you can pretty much do whatever you want, but the minute you start questioning and criticizing Israel, and as they say, convincing people on the right to begin questioning U.S. support for Israel as well, that is the red line, still the third rail in conservative politics. And you see these people whose priority is not the United States but Israel, whose number one goal is to ensure that this foreign policy that led us into so many destructive wars, especially in the Middle East, continues, and they know that anybody who is an impediment to that, who is to begin questioning it, who might convince other people to be skeptical of it as well, have to be destroyed. And that is what explains the sudden and very concerted and coordinated effort to destroy Tucker Carlson's reputation. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.